On July 12, 1979, a lawyer named Giorgio Ambrosoli was shot 4 times outside his home in Milan. 3 weeks earlier, he'd told a friend, "I know this will cost me dearly, but I'll have done my duty." The man who ordered his death ran a bank on Long Island. This is how a suburban American bank brought down one of the most dangerous financiers in the world, and how uncovering the truth got a man killed. Franklin National Bank wasn't supposed to be interesting. It started as a single branch in Franklin Square, a quiet Long Island suburb, and grew for decades on the back of a simple advantage. New York state banking law kept the big Manhattan banks from expanding into the suburbs. Franklin had the territory almost to itself. Between 1950 and 1962 alone, its assets grew from $78 million to over $1 billion. By the late 1960s, it was the 20th largest bank in the country. But growth like that attracts the wrong kind of attention. In 1968, the bank's longtime chairman was pushed out in a boardroom conflict of interest scandal involving a real estate deal. His successor brought in a new vice chairman, a wealthy shareholder named Lawrence Tisch, and it was Tisch's block of shares that would soon change hands in a sale regulators somehow failed to stop. In 1972, Michele Sindona bought that 21% stake. On paper, he looked like a savior, a self-made Milanese financier with a fortune reportedly worth $450 million. In reality, Sindona was a man with ties to the Vatican Bank, to Italian intelligence, to a secretive Masonic lodge called Propaganda Due, and, as investigators would later prove in court, to the Sicilian Mafia. Sindona didn't buy Franklin with clean money. He funneled the purchase through a Liechtenstein shell company called Fasco AG, using funds illegally pulled from banks he already controlled in Italy. He was already looting one financial system to acquire another, and U.S. regulators approved the sale anyway. And within 2 years, he'd done to Franklin exactly what he'd done everywhere else. Franklin's own foreign exchange desk was run by a currency trader who had already been fired from 2 other banks for improprieties. Under Sindona's ownership, that trader was allowed to make increasingly reckless bets on currency markets, chasing gains to paper over the bank's other problems. In the first 5 months of 1974 alone, Franklin lost $63 million, more than any American bank had lost in that span in the country's history. When regulators finally dug into the books, they didn't just find bad bets. They found falsified financial records, designed to hide the scale of the losses from examiners for as long as possible. On October 8, 1974, Franklin National Bank was declared insolvent. It remains, to this day, one of the largest bank failures in U.S. history, and at the time, it was the largest by a wide margin. But the collapse wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much darker one. Because Franklin was so large and so interconnected with the global banking system, the Federal Reserve made an unprecedented decision. Instead of letting it fail outright and risk a wider panic, they loaned it $1.75 billion to buy time, the largest bailout of a single bank in Federal Reserve history up to that point. It worked, in the narrow sense that global markets didn't spiral. The FDIC quietly arranged talks with 16 different banks before a European-American banking consortium agreed to buy the wreckage for $125 million. Depositors were protected. The financial system held. Michele Sindona was not so lucky, because on the other side of the Atlantic, his entire empire was collapsing with it, and someone was already building the case that would end him for good. An Italian lawyer named Giorgio Ambrosoli was appointed to liquidate Sindona's collapsed Italian banking empire, the same empire that had funded the illegal purchase of Franklin in the first place. Ambrosoli wasn't a prosecutor. He wasn't a detective. He was a court-appointed liquidator doing what should have been a quiet accounting job. Instead, he found himself tracing hundreds of millions of dollars through shell companies, offshore accounts, and Mafia-linked intermediaries, and he kept pulling the thread anyway, even after the threats started. He handed his findings directly to U.S. prosecutors, giving them the evidence they needed to indict Sindona for bank fraud in America. Sindona knew exactly what that evidence meant for him. So did the people who depended on him staying out of prison. So a few weeks before the story was supposed to end quietly in a courtroom, it took a much stranger turn. In August 1979, just before his U.S. trial was set to begin, Michele Sindona vanished from a hotel on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. For nearly 3 months, nobody knew where he was. When he finally resurfaced, in a payphone booth near Times Square, he had a gunshot wound in his leg and a story. He'd been kidnapped by left-wing Italian terrorists demanding a political statement. It was a hoax. Investigators later determined Sindona staged his own disappearance with help from his Masonic lodge connections, traveling through Austria, Italy, and Greece under a false identity, all to buy time and intimidate the witnesses lining up against him. His own defense team later admitted the kidnapping never happened. But by then, the real cost of his crimes had already been paid by someone else, 5 weeks earlier. Because 5 weeks before Sindona faked his kidnapping, Giorgio Ambrosoli, the man whose evidence was about to convict him, was already dead. Sindona had commissioned a hitman, paid in cash, to kill Ambrosoli outside his own home in Milan. Ambrosoli had known the risk for months. He'd told colleagues and even recorded testimony describing exactly the kind of threat he was under, should anything happen to him. He kept working anyway. His evidence survived him. Prosecutors used it against Sindona regardless. The murder didn't erase the paper trail Ambrosoli had already built, piece by piece, before anyone silenced him. In 1980, Michele Sindona was convicted in the United States for the fraud that destroyed Franklin National Bank. He was later extradited to Italy, tried again, and convicted of ordering Ambrosoli's assassination, sentenced to life in an Italian prison. In 1986, while serving that sentence, he died 2 days after drinking a cup of coffee laced with cyanide. To this day, no one has ever been definitively charged with putting it there. The regulatory fallout outlasted everyone involved. Franklin's collapse, happening at nearly the same moment as a separate but eerily similar currency-driven bank failure in Germany, forced central banks around the world to realize that a bank could now be too interconnected to fail quietly, and too global for any single country's regulators to fully see. It helped push forward the international banking reforms that followed later in the decade, changing how regulators cooperate across borders to this day. Franklin National Bank is remembered less for the balance sheet, and more for what it revealed: that a suburban Long Island bank could become the entry point for one of the most dangerous men in international finance, and that the one person who tried to stop him paid with his life, while the man responsible outlived him by 7 years anyway. If you want the next case the moment it drops, subscribe. Next up, how one commodities trader's fraud brought down a bank 2 decades before anyone thought "too big to fail" was a real phrase.